thought I'd start off with the very beginning, I guess. Do you remember the first movie that you went to see, and do you remember where you saw it?
Oh, I can't say I remember the first one because that's a lot of years ago, Matthew. We're talking about 85 years ago. No, I don't remember the first one. I have no idea. It possibly was a Tarzan movie or something. Saturday morning or something, when the boys in the neighborhood would get together and go to see a film at a local theater, usually consisting of two serials and a cowboy movie. That was the fare of the time. And the serials were kind of interesting because they were totally unrealistic. The chapter would end with the car going off the cliff, bursting into flame, and the next episode would be, well, it didn't actually go off the cliff. It got hung up and everybody got out of the car okay. It was just 13 episodes of expecting something exciting to happen, and it never did. So, but it was fun growing up with that. It was about the only kind of entertainment we had back in those days.
Do you remember the first movie that you remember seeing? Possibly Frankenstein?
It could have been, because as I recall, I think that was 1931, if I remember seeing the credits for it recently when I was watching it. So that meant I was 4 years old. Well, even assuming it took a year for it to get out of the first-run theaters downtown to the local theaters, say it took another year, well, I would be, 5 years old? And why my mother and father ever took me to see Frankenstein when I was maybe 4.5 years old is anybody's guess, because I had nightmares for years after that. So getting into bed at night and put the pillow over my head and always knowing that if I sat there long enough, I would suddenly see the monster's head come up in the window and look in at me. And the funny thing is, just recently I rewatched the old Frankenstein 31 film, and it was hardly frightening at all. I mean, didn't they know how to make scary movies back then? I mean, I know we've seen Frankenstein and the monsters and the 1,000 variations on the theme, and a dozen other men playing the monster. None of them they had the pathos that Karloff put into it. You could really feel sympathy for the poor creature. And after that, they were so cut and dried, they weren't really scary. Well, I remember we used to go and see all these new Frankenstein films that came out. There was an actor named Strange. His first name I don't remember, but I think he was a bartender in one of the Cowboys. He played a bartender in a lot of the films. Anyway, he played the monster once. And I don't know, the whole thing lost its eeriness somehow. They were all too made up to look like the monster. Karloff was, of course, a supreme actor, and he'd come in the first time and he'd seen the light, and he'd look up and he'd put his hands up, and like he's seeing the world for the first time. And you felt sympathy for him. The poor creature had seen nothing but darkness from the tomb or whatever else he was locked into, and all of a sudden he sees the light overhead coming in, and it was a moving section there, and I don't remember too much more about it. They were throwing the little girl in the water, thinking she was just another flower he was throwing in, and. But I mean, there was pathos in that first Frankenstein film, I thought. Like I say, you really could feel sorry for the poor devil. And I don't know if there's anything else to say about it, really.
Do you remember, do you remember any other films that really stuck out in your memory? Seeing, at a very young age, do you remember any that really made an impression?
Well, I used to see the films that the studios put out, like Beaugest, for instance. I was always a big thing for one brother's love for another brother. The ultimate sacrifice. They would sacrifice anything for each other. It's a good theme. So other than that one, what others were there? Then there was The Four Feathers, which was, I think, it may have been my favorite film of all time, actually. But there again, it's a sacrifice for the other group that carries the film forward. And I've always thought that's a theme that you cannot go bad. You can't lose on. If the film is based on the love of a person who sacrifices himself for others, it's going to be a hit. It just appeals to the audience. It's a selfless human being. I can't remember any others because that struck me as more than those two.
Can you tell us about the time that you went to see Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs?
Oh, well, that was my happiest day of my youth, no question about it. That was the happiest day of my youth. And every once in a while, I still play it. I played it one day last week. In fact, we went to California one day, and we were just traveling around, and you wanted to do something. I said, "Hey, wait! Look at that theater there. They're playing Snow White. I haven't seen it for years. You go and do your shopping. I'm going to just drop in and watch it." And I enjoyed it just as much this time as I did when I was 8 years old or something when it came out. And it was just a happy time in my life. That's the best I can say about it.
Remember the theater you saw it at, or the
experience? It was a local theater, and I think it was probably the Vilma was the closest theater to our house. The Ritz Theater was the closest one to where my mother was working, and as a cashier, and so I could go down there and see movies every day of the week. At no cost. I saved 12 cents by going before 6 o'clock. It only cost you about 12 cents. After it was 17 cents. So God, hurry up and get there before the clock clicks. Because 12 cents was a fair amount of money when you were during the Depression, and money was extremely hard to come by. It just to throw a nickel away for no reason at all, just because you were too darn slow to get to the theater in time, was just not allowed. Just you couldn't do it. And the local theaters, to me, had a tremendous binding effect on the whole group of people in your neighborhood. Everybody went to the movies as often as possible, and that was our entertainment. I always thought that the big studios really had a grip on things. There was something about the way they produced a movie. If they were making a Tyrone Power film, you knew it was going to be a good movie because Tyrone Power never appeared in anything that wasn't a good movie, whether it was Zorro or whatever. They were always entertaining. And of course, no bad language or anything like that.
Do you ever remember, along those lines, do you ever remember films that were off limits to see as a child? I mean, any films that were...
I don't think anything was. I mean, everything was so strictly controlled language or anything. It just didn't appear in those early films.
Do you remember any films that were controversial at the time? Maybe like films like Scarface or Todd Browning's Freaks, or anything that was generating controversy?
Well, I never saw Freaks. I think that was off limits even when I was 10 or 12 years old. I don't think I would have wanted to see it, first of all. I never liked watching the degradation of human beings. It just didn't appeal to me. But other than that, I can't think of anything that was ever really off limits. I mean, no nudity or bad language or anything was. In fact, you couldn't even show a woman being pregnant back in those days. She never swelled up in the front. It's amazing. This woman's going to have a baby next week, and she doesn't even look like it. Wonder what kind of a pill she's taking. but that's the way it was.
Yeah. Do you remember, to return to Snow White for a minute, do you remember when you went to see it? I know you mentioned that you had bought the little souvenir doll. Do you remember anything about did they have the theater decked out for the film? I mean,
I have no idea. But if Nana wants to run into my room and bring me back my little stuffed dopey, I'll hold it for you. It's one of the treasures of my youth. Yeah, it really was a magical time for me.
Did you feel that any of the subsequent Disney films had any of the same, have quite the same effect?
I don't think so. They were advertising one on TV today, Beauty and the Beast. Well, it wasn't the Beauty and the Beast that I saw. The first French film made after the war, when they got their industry back going again, the first one they did was the French version of Beauty and the Beast, and I'm sure we have a copy of it here somewhere on tape. And if I could watch it today and find it and watch it, I would, because it just fascinated me. There again, the pathos of the poor creature, the handsome young prince who returns into the beast, and I thought it was beautifully done. In fact, it may have won an award that year. You would know more than me about that.
I was wondering with one other. I wanted to get into talking about the foreign films that you saw at the Charles and at the Little Theater, but I wanted to get. You were talking a minute ago about the neighborhood theaters, and I wanted to ask what the difference was between those neighborhood theaters and the the first run, the studio owned theaters. Although I see we have the Dopey doll here.
Yeah, he's my prize. My prize. He looks at me all night long. He sits on top of the clock in my room. He sits there and looks at me. Stop staring at me already.
He was your favorite character from the film?
Oh yeah, of course, because he was. Snow White says, "Doesn't he ever talk?" And one of the others was, "We don't know. He's never tried, right?" But it was. I think Disney got Best Picture of the Year when he did Snow White. Do you recall that?
I think it was a special Oscar that he won that year for undertaking. It was the first full length American animated film. So I think that was at least with the in the sound era. So I know it had a lot of acclaim for that. And yeah, I believe he won. I believe they presented him with 7 miniature Oscars.
Yeah, well, they did that special program on him opening Disneyland in California when he first opened it up, and they did kind of a whole history of Walt Disney's life, and to me, of course, it interests anything to do with history interests me. Just sit there and don't get into trouble.
So I'm just going to go back to some of the films you remembered seeing as a child on their first runs. The Wizard of Oz.
Oh yes, right. Well, of course, that when she went from the black and white part of the film in her house being blown away in a hurricane, and she steps out into Oz land, and all of a sudden it's Technicolor. And we weren't used to Technicolor. It was just a showstopper. It just jarred you to say, what beauty. And I don't know whose idea that was, but it was a showstopper. And I thought perfectly cast. All the characters I thought were just beautifully cast.
Do you remember also seeing, you mentioned The Hunchback of Notre Dame?
Oh yeah. So that was, I cried when I sat in the theater and saw that.
Still does.
Yeah, well, I mean, when Lawton says to her, "Do you think this would be enough?" He said, "But I'm deaf too. The big bell made me deaf." That did it for me. even today it does. I thought Lawton, being the actor that he was so much better than the Man of 1,000 Faces. What's his name?
Lon Chaney.
Lon Chaney. I thought his Hunchback, he was just an ugly groan. Gnome was that. It didn't affect me off. I thought it was rather boring. So I thought the Lawton production was so much better. Especially the ending line, why couldn't I have been made of stone like you? He said to the gargoyles. I thought a beautiful film. And what other films that really affected me? Well, The Four Feathers did, because I just like stories about a brother who will sacrifice everything for his brothers. What other films were out in those days, Matthew? You're the expert on this.
I'm trying to think of some ones you've mentioned, like Stagecoach.
Oh, yeah, the first John Wayne, which I always thought was the best thing he ever did. Incidentally, I can't find a copy of it anymore. I don't know what's ever happened to that. I may have to rely on you, Matthew. the supplier of lost and ancient films. I thought he did such a good job on that, and especially John Wayne sitting on top of that stagecoach cross-legged and shooting the Indians as they come by. It was just a classic scene. The fact that he didn't know anything about the girl he was falling in love with was a little far-fetched. I mean, she lived in a section of town where there was no question what her vocation was, but he never seemed to get the point. And maybe he wasn't supposed to. Anyway, films were so different in those days. As I say, you didn't have to be afraid of being offended by language or subject matter. They just didn't allow it. When Clark Gable had to get special permission and in the what's it? That's Scarlett O'Hara. Gone with the Wind. To say, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. You didn't get special permission to say, damn. Good God, what are we coming to here? But at least you didn't have to worry about going to the movies with your grandmothers the way I did so often, and afraid something was going to be said that would be embarrassing, because it never was. Never.
Well, you mentioned that your mother worked as a cashier at a local theater. Can you tell us all about the theater, what you remember her work there?
It was just a regular neighborhood theater. It wasn't the one closest to us. It was close enough that you could walk to it. And certainly I did all the time, and so did my sister with me. And there was a second run after they finished at the big theaters that were owned by the various whatever you call them, the big studios who owned the theaters and the films in their own theaters that they owned. They would show first-rate films, and then they would drift down to the neighborhood theaters, and that's where almost everybody went to see them because they were cheaper. And I don't know what I was going to say now.
You were talking about the theater that your mother worked
Oh,
at.
yeah. So she was looking to substitute our income, and so she tried out for the cashier's job. The Ritz Theater was the one she worked for. And like I said, I could walk to it, and I used to walk down there often. I'd go in for nothing to see the movie.
Do you remember what street that was on? Because you were on
It was
Elmora Avenue.
Elmore, yeah, but this was I think this was off of Gay Street, which ran down all the way down into the downtown area. But the Ritz Theater was a section of Gay Street that was farther uptown, where it almost became I'm tongue-tied, I can't talk. it became another name, and it ran up into Pennsylvania as another name. So it was a long-running street. But the funny thing was, there was no fear of going out. You'd go out there at night to see a movie, and you'd come out, and it would be dark. And you'd walk home. My sister and I would walk home from the theater. And we had to walk past a large cemetery that was set up after the Civil War, and only blacks were buried there. That was quite close to the house we grew up in. And we had to walk down that sidewalk next to this long shrubbery, because nobody ever took care of that cemetery. It was a crime. I mean, graves were just collapsing in the ground, and nobody did anything about it. But we walked down that sidewalk for at least maybe 2 blocks. Anybody hiding in those bushes on the side could have just jumped out and grabbed you. So women were leery about it. They could walk across the street, and it was on a park, a Clifton Park golf course. No shrubbery, so they felt safe to walk down those streets. But
was that the nearest theater to your house?
yeah, the Vilma, was it Vilma? Vilma. That was an easy walk from our house. Well, I say easy walk. It was about a half a mile or something. The Ritz Theater, where my mother worked, that was walking. You could walk to it, but by the time you got there, your legs hurt a little bit. But they were quite close, and every neighborhood had at least one theater like that. That was the miracle of the neighborhood theaters. Everybody who lived in could walk to a theater and see films. 3 times a week there would be a different film being shown.
Do you remember what any of the programs were like in terms of were the double features, shorts, cartoons, that type of thing?
Well, the ones that I went to, they didn't have the double features. There was one that was farther away, which we never went to. I had a double feature. Mostly you'd go there, they would have the movie, the main movie, and then the news, and then a short subject, like Pete Smith's specialty, kind of little comedy. I don't know how many reels they were, but they maybe around 15 minutes. That was part of the regular program. And then the coming attractions, what films are coming to the theater next week, so to make sure you knew what was coming. So you could plan on going out and seeing a film. My sister and I, we were just young teenagers, and Gone with the Wind had finally made its way to the neighborhood theaters. And so we wanted to see it. And we had to walk to another theater farther away. It was a fairly good walk. And when we got inside, the only seats available were in the first row. So we sat there for 4 hours with our head like this. Everybody was 18 feet tall and about this wide. And we sat through the whole film to see it. Everybody had to see Gone with the Wind. And there's one scene in that film where it's a whole open area and there's nothing but cots and dead people, dying people. And someone made the comment, there were dead people in that scene that died in the Civil War. Not very nice, but probably true. And Clark Gable would not shave his mustache if he was going to play the part of Rhett Butler. He's not sacrificing his famous mustache for it.
Do you remember any of the serials that you would see at those times?
Gosh, I can't remember, but there was a group on for the kids on Saturday morning. It was the main thing to get you into the theater. And sometimes there would be 2 different serials. And they were all about 13 episodes long, as I remember. As I said before, they would end up with the car going off the cliff. So you had to tune in next week to see the next episode, but the car never actually got over the cliff. It always stopped short of it. And the kids would never say, how come, you know. It was just the way it was. Anyway.
So you were talking about the first run memories, going to the first run theaters.
Yeah, the only one I can recall that we actually went to, and it may have been right after I'd been so sick and nobody knew if I was going to make it or not. My mother took me on the streetcar. We went downtown to one of the first run theaters so I could see Snow White. Yeah. It was either Snow White or now I think about it, it was Snow White. And it was a magic day to me. It was the happiest day of my childhood, no doubt about it. And afterwards, she took me to a 5 and 10 cent store and bought me a very fancy 6-shooter and a holster, so I could wear that around it sometimes. So those days were few and far between during the Depression, I'll guarantee you. So it meant a lot to me.
Now, you also mentioned one time to me about the whole family, I think it was, going to see The Lady Vanishes by Hitchcock.
Oh, yes, yes.
Now, and you also mentioned that at that point, that Hitchcock's name alone was enough for you to go see the film.
Oh, yes, oh, yes.
And do you remember the first Hitchcock film that you saw, is there anything you can tell about that?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't The Lady Vanishes. I think maybe it was the very first one. And I only remember one thing about it. It's funny how those things will stick in your mind. My aunt, my father's sister, she was always kind of fascinated by it. In one scene in that film where the little old lady is sitting in the seat inside the train, and she's supposed to be the little old lady that vanishes, right? Disappears. And she looks up at the camera. As my aunt used to say, she had that hard German face. She had just a mean-looking face. And you were expecting a kindly little old lady. Hitchcock did that on more than one occasion. He'd like to bring people into it that you'd say, how unusual, you know. Especially elderly ladies seem to play a part of his technique. I don't know how to describe it, but it was always a kind of a shocker.
It's interesting that you mentioned even that early on, though, that Hitchcock's name was enough of a draw.
Oh, absolutely.
But you said that was the first one of his films that you actually saw. Did he just have a reputation from his earlier British films that
we never saw any of the early British films. Later on in years, when we start to see him again, I'd say, how the hell did he ever survive? They were lousy, stinking films as far as I was concerned. Boring. That's just me, but
you felt like but do you remember seeing The Man Who Knew Too Much or The 39 Steps on their first run?
I may have seen The 39 Steps. Not The Man Who Knew Too Much. I think I didn't see that until they started to play him on television.
Do you remember any other directors whose name alone at that time would have been enough to bring you in to see a movie?
I don't think any of us knew that much about movie making in those days, Matty. A movie was a movie. If it had a good star in it, like I say, Tyrone Power or John Wayne or something, you'd say, well, it's going to be a good film if they're in it. But as to who the directors were or something, yeah, that wouldn't have meant anything to me, certainly.
Do you remember any names at all? Seeing them, every week in the credits, do you remember any names that, seeing them week after week that stood out to you? I mean, besides stars, of course, but either any directors or any other names?
Well, there's two, and I marvel at it even today. I think it must be MGM Studios. It's always the two names, and they're always linked, one behind the other. One's art director, and I can't remember who it is, but now I can't think of either one of their names. But it used to fascinate me. They were on every movie made by like MGM over a long period of time. Boy, talk about security. They couldn't I don't know. But anyway, Gibbons and somebody
Douglas
else.
Shearer, I think.
Shearer and Gibbons. That's
yeah.
it. That's right. Yeah. Nora Shearer's husband or
brother, I think.
brother. Yeah.
Yeah, she was married to Thalberg.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Saw to it that Shearer had long-term employment with the studio.
Yes.
Do you remember? So talking about, I guess, going a little further ahead when you were in the Army. Now, when was that about? When you were in the Army?
Well, let's see. I was say 18. 18. I was born in 27. So what does that make? 37, 47. It was right after the war ended, say at 45. It had to be about 45, 1945. Yeah.
Do you remember seeing movies while you were in the Army? Did they show films at the base or anything?
Yeah, but they were it was taking feet off or, always just before lunchtime they take you to show you a movie with tearing a man's trench foot off. It used to be a big joke. They always saved it for that. No, I don't remember too much about it.
It was mostly training films.
Oh yeah, it was. They did run movies at night. If you wanted to go to the theater, and you didn't have anything else scheduled, you could just walk over to the theater and see it. I don't remember too much about it.
Right around the time you got out of the Army is when you said a lot of the great foreign films started appearing.
Well, it's only when I became aware of them, in any case, not knowing too much about it.
Right. Do you remember, you mentioned one time going to the Little Theater to see The Mikado.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that was a red letter day because, as I said before, the color and the pastel colors of the whole production, it just stopped me in my tracks. I'd never seen anything that beautiful before. And, of course, I enjoy Gilbert and Sullivan's music.
Do you have any other memories of the Little Theater or any films that you saw there?
No, not a one. I used to go there fairly often. We won't talk about that.
How about Beauty and the Beast? Do you remember where you saw that?
No, I do not remember. It almost certainly was a local theater, not a first-run theater. And it may have been years after it actually came out, but everybody was showing the film one time or another or whatever. And it's only because I was so captivated by the sheer beauty of the characters in it and the way it was produced and directed. To me, it was a winner, and I don't think I've ever gotten a copy of it, come to think of it, Matt. I can't imagine I didn't. Sometime over the years, televised it off the television channel that was carrying old films. Especially since it was, like I said, the first one after the war that the French industry produced. I may be wrong about that. I have to go to you for that, but I think it was.
Do you remember any other foreign films that you started to see in those post-war years, or at least any that made a real impression?
See, your problem is you're dealing with that. You're dealing with a 90-year-old brain here, and I don't remember all that much stuff anymore. No, I have no idea anymore.
You mentioned once that a neighbor had found I think they had found that somebody was throwing it out. It was like a 16 millimeter projector and some films.
Yep.
And you screened them one night. Do you remember? Can you tell that story?
Well, I don't remember any of the details of it. I remember the story actually happened. It was a friend of the family drove a trash truck, and he was the driver. And one day they were picking up trash, and he saw they were throwing out all this stuff to do with 16 millimeter film, was it? Or 8 millimeter, probably. And he brought it home, and we all went to their house one night to see what he had, what he found. And it was fun, but I can't remember what the name of the film that we saw anymore, but we were kind of captivated by the fact that, boy, you can see your own movies here when you got a projector, you know.
You ever remember seeing movies at the Hippodrome Theater in Baltimore? I know you mentioned seeing Abbott and Costello there. Can you share that story?
Well, they were one of the two theaters in town that had vaudeville, and that was the end of the vaudeville era, you know. The other was a smaller local theater who really didn't carry the first run vaudeville teams. But Abbott and Costello, as a kid, we were crazy about Abbott and Costello. So after they appeared on the stage during one of their films at the Hippodrome Theater, all of us kids ran backstage to see them when they would come out and sign an autograph, you know. And I was shocked to see that Abbott had reddish hair. Well, in a black and white film, it didn't look reddish. It just looked light blonde or something, you know. So that was kind of a surprise. Don't remember much more than that.
You remember the time you saw Richard Liu?
Oh, yeah. Well, that was sort of, I guess that had been toward the end of the war or right after. He always played a Japanese villain or a general or something that tortured people, that type of thing. And so I was interested to see him, and they always had him on the stage with a yellow spot on him to make his skin yellow, you know. That's about all I remember about him. Next.
Well, when movies started appearing on TV, do you remember when you got, roughly when you got your first TV set, and roughly when you started being able to watch movies on, The Late Show? And do you remember any of the early programs that would have run movies like late
I don't remember the name of the programs, but we had like 3 local channels here: ABC, CBS, and NBC.
And this would have been probably in the early to mid 50s when you got the first TV.
Well, we were married in 51, and that's when I bought the television set. It was a beauty, blonde wood with doors that you opened up to see the screen. I went hog wild. I had to have that when I saw it in the store once. And we bought it. That was shortly after we were married, I guess. So it had to be somewhere around 51, 52 or 3. And it was a 17-inch tube. It was a biggie. Bringing the neighbors, look how well off we are. We got a 17-inch television set, black and white. Yeah, I used to go to other people's houses to watch their program once in a while. Special Uncle Milty. Everybody had to see Uncle Milty on whatever night Milton Berle was coming on. It was almost a tradition back in those days, because he was possibly the best thing on television at that time. That'll give you an idea how bad it was.
You mentioned you remember watching the McCarthy hearings.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I go to bed with my stomach in a knot. He was so contemptible. And they would rebroadcast it, because the hearings were during the day, I'm sure, and they were filmed. And then they would redo it at night. And he was just so contemptible. That sneer on his face all the time. And we no sooner got rid of him than we came up another winner. We seem to go through a series of oddball people in our politics. I don't know why that should be, but God knows we got the worst of the worst right now going to us, as far as I'm concerned. Trump.
Do you see similarities watching the 24-hour news now with watching the McCarthy hearings? I mean, do you see a lot of similarities in terms of how it's covered?
Exactly. So, Matt, because back in those days, you were lucky to catch a rebroadcast of something like the McCarthy hearings, because it just wasn't done. It didn't draw an audience. People weren't interested in that. They wanted to see Uncle Milty, that type of thing. But if you were a history buff, especially if people like him turned you off, you always had to watch it. Shine Shoes. I remember that horrible joke about some guy named Shine, one of his investigators, I think. And there was something about his shoes, and so that was a joke that McCarthy pulled. So Shine Shoes.
Do you think that being able to watch the hearings on TV helped play a part in his downfall?
Oh, definitely so, because it was, what the heck was his name? The best investigating, I can't think of the word, reporter of the time. What was his name? I can't think of it. Famous. He was famous. He even had another show where they'd go and visit people in their homes, and he would question.
Edward R. Murrow.
Edward R. Murrow, right? And the whole idea was, Edward R. Murrow says, we're going to let him convict himself. The only thing we're going to show on this program is him talking and what he says. And it did. It destroyed him. And then they brought that little New England lawyer into it. And he just ripped him to shreds. He said, I remember the famous line, Mr. McCarthy, have you at last what was the word? Humanity or common sense. He just humiliated him, and you could see McCarthy just melt. It was a master stroke. The little old New England lawyer. It was all done live, or they may have been filmed earlier in the day, but you were seeing the live production. And just the way the little old man said, have you at last
No shame.
What's that?
No shame.
Machine.
No shame.
Oh, no shame, yes, something. Have you at last no shame? And that was the end of McCarthy. He finally ended up doing the one decent thing he ever did in his life. He drank himself to death and died young. So you have to give him credit for what he did right as well as what he did wrong. I used to turn my stomach over at night. I'd get in bed at night and I couldn't sleep. So anyway, that was probably the most important thing being done on television back in those days, because it was such an expose. And now for 24 hours a day, they're trying to show Trump for what he is, and it never quite gets across because there's always somebody to counteract what's being discussed, so someday they'll get enough together on their special investigations, maybe to kick him and the rest of his family out. You live in hope. And with that, I really should think I've said enough, Matthew.
Well, let me ask you this. Can you tell the story? You were talking about riding into work with your neighbor to see, after seeing movies on TV late at night. So a couple of things. One, can you talk about, the films you were seeing late at night, like I said, when they first started appearing, and then the story about Captain Kidd.
Oh, yes. Charles Lawton. Good old Charlie Lawton. He was so good. He was playing Captain Kidd. And in it, he has absolutely no sophistication at all. He's just a damn old pirate, right? But he wants to get in good with the ruling class. So he has to learn some manners and how to say things. So he hires a butler, an English butler. And so the butler's job was to constantly no, sir, we don't drink or have the soup with that spoon. We have this spoon for the soup, and all this silly stuff. And finally, the punchline was, the guy's name was Smithers or something like that. And he says, he gets interrupted. He says, "Confounded Smithers, you've driven the thought right out of me mind, and it was an uncommon pretty one, too." Well, Bill and I just cracked up on that. We used to quote it once in a while driving to work the next day. He used to drive, and I used to be a passenger.
The story about when you were helping your neighbor set up his train garden in the basement.
Oh, God, yeah. Oh, yes. Well, that was not funny, except at the moment, just the way the line came out, it was so funny. "You've driven the thought right out of my mind, and it was an uncommon pretty one, too." The other neighbor, he was setting up the train track and everything. Harvey. And he stood up suddenly, and he hit that iron bar across holding the whole house together. Bong! And out of the silence, Bill says, "And it was an uncommon pretty one, too." Well, I just doubled over. It was the perfect answer for that. Yes, you've driven the thought right out of my mind. And Harvey did not think it was funny. And it wasn't funny, but just the way it came out, the perfect retort to somebody knocking his brains out.
So would you say that with TV, that was the main reason you stopped going to see more movies? I mean, it seems like...
Oh, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about just like how the whole film culture changed at that point?
Well, I mean, because before that, it was your one course of entertainment, unless you just wanted to listen to the radio at home. You always had radio. And the radio programs were pretty childish at the time, but we thought they were hot diggity dog stuff. The Shadow, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men, the Shadow does.
How about the Dragnet?
Oh, yeah, Dragnet. Boy, Nana could tell us about that. We'd go to a dance or something at night, 2 or 3 couples, right? And when Dragnet came on the radio, the 3 guys at the table, myself included, would get up and go out to the car and listen to Dragnet on the radio in the car. And when it was over, we'd come back in again. Now, talk about having a devoted audience. Do you remember that, honey? No? I'm sure it was you. Okay, well, they used to run the local theaters. 1 or 2 of them would run a movie late at night, maybe starting at 11 p.m. And I remember the one, Veronica Lake was the girl in Baltimore who talked about the film coming up and whatever there was about it that might be interesting. And it was kind of a shock to see her reduced to such a position because she had been very big with the Alan Ladd films of it as his leading lady. And she was a beautiful woman. And here all of a sudden, I think she had a problem with alcohol. I think it was. And she'd been reduced to finding work at a local TV station, introducing these movies late at night. And show business is full of heart-rending stories. And I can't think of anything else that would reflect her.
Do you remember when you started seeing a lot of these films again? Were a lot of them films that you remembered from seeing the first time around? And did it kind of reintroduce you to a lot of films?
Oh, yeah, sure. But the thing was, when you had to pay to go to see the movies back when I was a kid, you just didn't go that many times. I don't give a hoot if it was only 12 cents to see a film. There weren't that many 12 cents to go around, but when they started to show them on TV for nothing, well, of course, you watched them all the time. And you got to see a lot of films that you never saw before. I mean, big name stars, Clark Gable and that type, which maybe you didn't see when you were growing up, that you could now see them almost nightly on television. So it was a great boon to people who were looking for cheap entertainment in the evening.
Did it when you saw these films again? Some of after maybe 20 years in some cases, was it a strange kind of a strange experience seeing how different they looked at that time because you hadn't seen anything like it in the interim?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the first type of thing I would have noticed, and I still do today. They'll say so and so, and I'll say, "My goodness, he looks so much older." You're just not used to seeing them looking that much older. And maybe that's not a good thing. I don't know.
Do you think it's different now with old films from all different decades constantly being run on channels like TCM and all the other cable channels that are showing movies from the 15 years ago or from the 90s or the 80s, and it's all kind of blurred together now in a lot of ways? Do you think that in some ways it's less jarring to see an old film today because we're so used to seeing all these old films all the time?
Well, possibly so. I think your brain adjusts quickly to something. You see, you might see Clark Gable when he didn't have a mustache anymore. He was so young, and or he was singing a song. Well, Lord, you never saw Clark Gable singing a silly song, but there was a film, whose name I don't remember anymore, where he did, and you adjust to it quickly. After all, he's an actor and he's playing a part, so he could play any part that he felt like playing, or he was assigned to play back then. That didn't make a difference to me.
And did you ever get into? Did you ever have any interest in film collecting? And I'm talking about before video. But did you ever have any interest? Like you mentioned, your neighbor finding those film prints in the trash.
Yeah.
Did you ever have any thought at all about collecting films to watch at home?
Never occurred to me. No, I probably didn't know that you could. But it just never occurred to me, that's all.
Now, how about when videotape appeared? You got a VCR. I know you started recording a lot at that point.
Yeah, well then it was, Katie barred the door because you were able now to record right off the television. They were playing all these movies and you could just start and record every movie that came along. Unfortunately, that's what I was doing. Pretty soon, your wife says to you, "What are you going to do with all that trash?" And so, yes, it was definitely a boon, but it was just such a wonderful thing that suddenly now you could have all these films that you had to wait for a theater to come and show them and hope that you wouldn't miss it the next time they were showing it, and you could do it yourself and play it any time of the day or night.
I guess cable TV was another boon in terms of just being able to see so much.
Oh yeah, well, TCM, not pardon the pun, but I mean it was the best thing I had ever seen happen to television. TCM, because they played every kind of a film. It wasn't just the big money makers. They would play films that you never knew existed, and you say, "Boy, that's a good film." Especially some of the older, middle or early 30s and coming forward.
Did you at any point? And I'm talking like later on here. Did you after these films started appearing on TV? Did you ever have any interest in going to see them on like the classic films on a big screen again? Like I know you mentioned you went to see the Batman serial when they played it at the I think it was at the Charles.
Yes, my son and I went to see the Batman serial, 13 episodes in one evening, until your eyes were laying out of your cheeks. And every time it would end with them going over the cliff, and the next time the next episode would start, and they weren't going over the cliff. And to little kids, it didn't make any difference, But my God, 13 episodes in a row, and it really was too much. As much as Chris and I wanted to see them, it was just too much.
Do you remember going to see any other older films at any point? When they would bring them back to a theater, like the Charles.
Well, there must have been one or two, but offhand I don't remember. I remember, like as we said, the French Beauty and the Beast. That always sticks in my mind because I was just so taken with that particular movie.
You saw some of the Japanese films around that time, right?
Oh, yes.
Rashomon and Seven Samurai.
Oh, yes, right. And taped them, of course, because they were classics. Well, in this day and age, you could lock yourself in your bedroom and throw away the key and say, "Don't wake me up until next spring. I'm watching movies," and you never run out. I mean, my God, think of the number of films that have been made, even going back into the days of the silent films and forward. It's a countless number of movies. So you could sit and watch a different movie or two movies every night for the next 50 years, and you wouldn't run out of them.
Does it ever surprise you, like when you're looking back at it at this point, does it ever surprise you how much interest there is in film now as an art form, and how a lot of the films that used to play just maybe a regular run-of-the-mill movie that would play at the local theater each week, how it's become something that people study and...
Oh, only since you came on the scene, because it's your field. So naturally, we learn more about it just having you around and talking about it. But I never personally gave much attention to it because heaven knows I wouldn't be able to do it. But
does it surprise you that these names are known again after 80 or 90 years? Thanks to TCM and channels like that.
Oh, yeah, well, that's what I say. I think TCM is probably the best thing that's ever happened to local television viewing, because they just cover everything to their credit. Not just the classic comedies of Keaton and the rest of them, but people that you didn't even realize were making films, and suddenly they're showing some of them on TCM, and you say, well, it's quite good. I'm surprised I hadn't seen it before this.
Is there any other, with movies now being streamed on computers and on cell phones, does it seem to you that the interest in them will just continue to go as long as people have a way of watching them?
Well, I would think so. I mean, certainly the ones that appeal to me, I don't care how old the thing is, even if it's just after sound came in. I don't like silent films to any degree. I mean, unless it's Birth of a Nation or something. It's a classic that everybody should be forced to sit down and watch, if nothing else. But I don't care too much for reading subtitles all the time. It distracts me. Not only that, but I don't read that fast, and I rarely get through the end of the written word before they've taken it off and on to the next scene. And that happens even today when I watch first the Japanese channel. If it's one of their programs that's done in Japanese but with subtitles, I never get a chance to finish reading the line. I'm a very slow reader, or I don't see it or something. But my favorite would be the channels that have no commercials. God knows we have enough commercials to last everybody, especially automobile ads.
Are there any films that have stuck with you as favorites that to this day, that if you were going to sit down and watch a movie tonight, you'd say, this is one that I could...
Oh, definitely, so absolutely, but don't ask me to name them right now because my recall stinks, unless I have something to remind me. But gosh, there must be 30 or 40 films that I could watch again and again and again, because there's something about it that just appeals to me. And it's like I said before, the theme of one brother sacrificing himself for another brother, to me, is just an absolutely winning formula for a successful film.
I know you mentioned recently watching Grand Hotel and Dinner at 8
Oh yes,
again.
yeah.
Are those, I mean, I guess you probably, I don't know if you saw them when they first came out, but are they films that you've been seeing for years on television?
I probably saw them when they first came out, although it's not the kind of a film that a lot of people would be interested in. But and I've got they're the first two one extended tape that I have with lots of movies on it. They're the first two that are on there because I think those two films are classics. But you remember lines from what's her name? The old lady that Dressler, Marie Dressler. She says to the girl, "That's the problem with death. It's so final." And just the way she says it, and you realize she's making a statement that you better learn it because it's never going to change. Death is so final, and you have to accept the fact that he's now dead and get on with your life, But a lot of those films had really interesting subculture messages in them, which I really find interesting. In fact, I go around and memorize a lot of them because that's how much they mean to me. I love to memorize certain things, and you can call on it whenever you want. It's amazing how the mind will just remember long passages of something, and it's just nice to be able to bring up because the messages in the real is like no man is an island. I mean, it covers every kind of an episode. You're not by yourself. You're part of everything, and I marvel at the people that can dream up those thoughts and put it down on paper. That not just Shakespeare. Everybody knows Shakespeare was beyond comparison. But I mean, John Donne and some of the others were just, no man is an island. That's true enough. But to be able to say it is the miracle to me. How he sat down and dreamed this up, that short little passage of every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And I used to go down to the main library and get that book out every once in a while, just because it was the very beginning quotation in the book on the first page. And that's where I memorized it. Anyway, I was always a sucker for good passages from literature.
Do you think that the best films kind of have that same ability to, stay with people?
I think so. It almost has to be something memorable that sticks with you. And although I can't think of anything offhand, but feel that bill the way just reading it in a book. Or Agatha Christie so often started one of her stories off with a famous passage from somewhere else. So if you were interested in learning little short passages, that was a good place to go, because almost every one of her books, she would pick something out, and that would be part of the plot of the story.
It's interesting how so many filmmakers today will use that same device of borrowing from, quoting from a previous film. You recognize it.
Right, exactly, sure.
It relates somehow to the new story that they're telling or the new idea that they want to get across.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's a final question for you.
Okay.
And I'm curious, you can take a minute to think about this. What is there a star or a film or any? Yeah, I mean, I guess mainly any star is what I'm thinking of here. Who was enormously popular when you were growing up, or even at any point that you remember, who was enormously popular, who you never hear about today, who is almost you never see their films on TV or hardly ever hear their name. Is there one that really sticks out to you?
Offhand, I can't, because the films we see on TV that are constantly being reshown over the years were the actors who made the role famous to begin with, or the roles that they appeared in. For instance, to me, there's never been a cowboy or a western like. Now I think of his name. This is terrible. You better cut the film. It'd take me 5 minutes to think of his name.
I think of John Wayne.
No, not John Wayne. To me, he was an actor. He was a celebrity, but not much of an actor. He always played the same role all the time. Well, he played it well, but it was the Quiet Man was a deviation from his usual sitting on the stagecoach and popping Indians off. But I can't think of their names.
Gary Cooper.
Gary Cooper was the ultimate Western star to me. He tall, lanky, spoke with a slight drawl. I could identify with him when he was playing a role. I could identify him in that role. And the comedy actors like Melvin Douglas, very few people would say, "Oh, who was he?" But he made some really classic, humorous films. I enjoy every one of them when I see them. Offhand, Eddie, I can't think of anything else.
Well, I guess that's it.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing these memories with us.
You're welcome.